welcome, and maybe let us begin. Yes? Um, Welcome everyone to the American Studies, Polish Studies panel. This was supposed to be an American Studies panel, but then we learned that there is a wonderful Polish Studies scholar from the US here, so we decided that it would probably be of interest to you, our audience, our students, to also learn about Polish studies in the US. So we're doing Polish studies in the US and American studies in Central Europe, and this is Central Europe because we have panelists who are not only from Poland, but also from the Czech Republic. This is Antonin here, and of course Joanna from the United States. So our idea for this panel is slightly different than the idea for the previous panel. Basically, everybody is going to talk about American studies or Polish studies, depending on what they do, and to situate themselves within American studies or Polish studies, and to talk about the new trends, what is changing, what is happening, what people want to study and what they don't want to study. So that's the drill. And we're going to go in the following order. There we go, that's the order. And I will introduce each of the panelists reading out their short bio before they speak. So maybe like to not read out all the bios first. So I would like to ask Joanna Niżyńska, who is our only representative of Polish studies here, to speak first, and let me introduce her before she does that. Everyone will speak for about 6-7 minutes. Joanna Niżyńska is Associate Professor of Polish Literature and Culture at the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at Indiana University in Bloomington, USA. From 2015 to 2020, she served as director of the Polish Studies Center at Indiana University. She holds a master's degree in classics from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland and a PhD in comparative literature from the University of California, Los Angeles. From 2004 to 2013, she taught in the Slavic department at Harvard University. Joanna's research interests focus on trauma and cultural memory in post-communist Poland, comparative memory studies, and the globalization of Western theory in Eastern Europe. She is the author of The Kingdom of Insignificance, Miron Białoszewski and the Quotidian, the Queer and the Traumatic, co-editor of Germany, Poland, and Post-Memorial Relations in Search of a Livable Past, and Being Poland, A New History of Literature and Culture since 1918. And this is an 800+ page interdisciplinary volume written with an English-speaking audience in mind. As a Fulbright US scholar at the Polish Institute of Advanced Studies, PIAST, in Warsaw, she is currently working on a book project investigating cultural memory of the 1968 anti-Semitic campaign in contemporary Poland. Joanna, the floor is yours, and maybe let me hand over the microphone.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm a token scholar. When I was invited to this panel, I thought that this might be a mistake because we are going to compare apples and oranges. But why apples and oranges? Well, simply because Polish studies is a really tiny field in American academia, while English studies is a respected and huge field in Polish academia, but maybe my experiences will serve as a good point of reference to contrast our institutional identities. So let me just start by a very general remark that Polish studies in the US is something completely different than the way I understand it than Polish studies in Poland, or Polonistyka in Poland. You cannot simply do Polonistyka in English. That's not the difference, that you are a Polonist, except that you teach in English and you write in English. You really need to take into consideration a very diverse audience, large audience that really doesn't know much about your field. So I have a very strong disagreement with some of my esteemed colleagues in the US who hold positions at American universities but publish only in Kraków, where they have their fandom and where they are known. Because I think that, you really need to take care of the field, and the field has a very different profile. So my debate with with these scholars was public, so I'm not hinting at anything. It's just, it is what it is. What is the field? The field of so-called Polish studies is either part of various Slavic areas housed in the Slavic departments, or very often it's part of what we call East European studies that are housed in various East European centers. For Americans, I believe that most often when they think about Poland, they think about East European cultures, and those cultures somewhere between the West and Russia. So truly the relevance of the field really depended on political developments. So the heydays of Polish studies in the US, it's really the worst period for Poland, the late 70s, the 80s, the beginning of the 90s. Why? Well, Poland was featured in major newspapers. There was a great interest in the Solidarity movement and martial law, the transformation, and so on, so on. And so the field was very well funded at the time. In general, Slavic studies are really the result of the Cold War. The US needed scholars and linguistically trained people to be able to deal with Russia predominantly, and to produce spies. And seriously, we have several graduates historically from my department that became American spies. Right, so once the country became normal, the normalcy really, the more normal, the less funded. But I think what is the result of this Cold War origins is that in the mind of American scholars or American intelligentsia, people who read New York Times and New Yorker, that homogenized view of the region, this East European region, which is, again, the region between Russia and the West, that region that is a buffer region, it really persisted in spite of the changing cultural and political circumstances. So became kind of an anachronistic label, and we are now hindered as a field because, again, we need to somehow position ourselves or argue against it. And in general, I would say that Poland Polish studies fall through the cracks between the first world. It is called minor culture. In the Slavic department, we have major culture, and it's really Russian culture, and then several minor cultures, like Czech, like Polish, like Ukrainian, like Bosnian, Croatian, Serbian. Romanian was sometimes part of the Slavic departments, even though linguistically it doesn't belong to the same group. So it's not a major culture, it's not the first world culture, and at the same time, it's not the third world culture that would really qualify itself to be retrieved by, let's say, post-colonial studies as an unknown culture. So we don't have enough symbolic capital to be in the third world, which for academic circulation now is helpful. Certainly we don't have enough to be in the first world. So maybe the war in Ukraine will shift something. Maybe it will really diminish a bit the Russian hegemony. But I actually think it will only reinforce the patterns that we already have. So why do I talk about labels, East European studies, Slavic studies, Polish studies? I think that labels are very important because we identify ourselves in our academic communities by these labels. We evaluate our colleagues by labels. I was just talking to a friend of mine in Polish academia who is going to be promoted to full professor, and she said, well, I'm really a cultural studies person, but I need to write this entire application, however you call it, right, to be promoted as a literary studies person, and I need to really shift my vocabulary. And this is how it works. These are institutional labels. And so it's our self-identity, it's how jobs are advertised, it's a matter to what publishing houses we send our manuscripts. So labels actually really matter. And they also matter in terms of Polish studies in the US when it comes to translations. Because translations are also privately and publicly funded, and my field relies on translations. I cannot teach, I very rarely can teach in the original. So also translations, what is available really profiles what you can teach or what you can work on in terms of books, because it makes no sense actually to work on something that it has not been translated. My work on Miron Białoszewski, it's the first book in the US on Białoszewski, was kind of maybe a foolish project in a sense, because only one work by Białoszewski was translated and known, that was the memoir of the Warsaw Uprising, and nothing else was translated. But because of this book, I must say modestly, there probably will be a few more translations. Why? Because once you have a scholarly academic publication on the author, it's easier for translators to get funds for translations. So I work on Polish-Jewish memory studies at this point. This interest really developed from my initial interest in trauma. And I think this is actually one of those moments when I can reach larger audiences by working together with Jewish studies, with history, sociology, and other cross-disciplinary studies. But, 1 minute, oh my goodness. I generally believe that we need to create the demand rather than respond to it. So we do not respond to the demand because sometimes there is no demand. We need to first create it. And I believe that I had the entire speech on globalization, but I will skip it. But I believe that comparison on which comparative literature is based on multi-directionality is really a way to go. And that it's very important to insist on the local as something of global importance. And I just wanted to leave you with this kind of example of what we can do. I don't know if you know media artist William Kentridge from South Africa. He's ethnically European, but he made this very fascinating hybrid installations of post-colonial African history. And he claims, really is very cutting-edge artist, and he claims that he is influenced by Ryszard Kapuściński, and that the landscape that he uses in representation of Africa is influenced by the Katyn massacre landscape. This is really a very weird constellation, but that's the kind of constellation, I think, that would be very, very interesting to explore. So I think that, instead of pitching globalization in academia against the national models, we can actually use the two to critically rethink one through the other. So let me just leave out my spiel at that, and I don't know who is next.
Thank you very much. I hope maybe some of the issues will also come up in the discussion, so we will be able to elaborate as we discuss. And thank you very much, Joanna. Our next speaker is Antonin Zita, who teaches English and academic writing at Masaryk University in Brno. We have an Erasmus agreement with Brno, so if you want to go, you can talk to Antonin. His research focuses on the writers of the Beat generation, especially Allen Ginsberg and William Burroughs. His doctoral dissertation on the reception of the Beat writers in Czechoslovakia came out in book form in 2018 from Masaryk University Press. While a graduate student, he held the William J. Hlavinka Fellowship at Texas A&M University. Antonin, the floor is yours.
Okay, so hello everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. Also, I'd like to thank, first of all, Justina and Marek and Katarzyna. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, for the very warm welcome. And So let me talk about what I want to talk about here. I first thought that I could discuss the state of American studies in the Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, and talk about how Brno, which is the second largest city in the Czech Republic, was somewhat off the grid during 1950s, 60s, 70s, which allowed Brno to actually flourish in a way that Prague, which was under the view of communist censors and the communist officials in general, couldn't do. But then I realized that that may not be exactly very beneficial to this discussion here, to both students and maybe faculty. So I'd like to talk about more, rather than the past, I'd like to talk about the present and the future. And I will be bringing in my personal experience from the Texas A&M graduate studies that Justina mentioned. Well, truth be told, that there are two facts I feel that we need to acknowledge. I'll be talking about at least the situation in the Czech Republic. I'm not sure if it's the same in Poland, but I would presume that it has some similarities. So I believe we first need to acknowledge two facts about students and our students. And the fact number one is that most students who finish, for example, their bachelor's or graduate studies, master's studies, will not be working directly in the field of, for example, literature. They will be using the skills, some of them to a greater degree, for example, those working in education, those working as translators, interpreters. They may be also using their skills to a lesser degree in various different occupations, because being a student of literature is not just about reading literature, but also learning certain skills, which is critical reading, searching for sources, using sources, time management, this kind of stuff. It may seem not important, but it actually is. And as minor digression, there is a reason why in a lot of fields outside of education, humanities students are preferable to, or at least show very good results, as opposed to those students who graduate in those specific areas. So, maybe that's I can expand on that in the discussion part. So that's one thing we need to discuss. And I feel secondly is that the problem with Central Europe and our studies of American literature is that we're not really, I feel at least, we're not really trendsetters, but trend followers. And this also has certain impact on, for example, our postgraduate or doctoral students in terms of the practical part of the research, which is, for example, getting grants to go to important conferences like the MLA, getting grants to look up important libraries and where important primary, secondary material of authors are housed, important collections. This is also difficult for our students, for our graduates to reach, simply because there's an economic factor, and this is something difficult to balance. On the other hand, and I feel that this is where we have an edge, is the linguistic factor. The fact that our students oftentimes speak one or two secondary languages. It's first the primary language, Czech in my case, Polish in the case of the students here, English, obviously, and possibly German, French, other languages. I'm not sure which languages do students here gravitate towards here in Poland, outside of English. And why I'm saying this is that I think 2 weeks ago I finished reading Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands. And when you look at the sources he used, what are the sources he used? He used sources not only in English, but written in Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, German, right? Without having the language, you can't do this kind of research. So being proficient in the language gives, I believe, our students a certain edge. But then the question is, so what? How can I use Polish when I'm an American Studies person? And this leads me to believe that it is time that we in Central Europe make a case for there being areas of scholarship which are worthwhile to study, even those outside this area. So for example, I am greatly interested in socialist realism as a literary criticism. I'm not interested in it because I feel it is worthwhile. It is a legitimate way of seeing literature, but I'm interested as a theoretical model which sees literature and art in general as having a certain function, and literature and art in general needs to follow certain rules to meet this function, to meet this objective. And I find this as something that is interesting even today, because we will always talk about what art is and what we want art to be. We will always talk about what we think art should achieve, and there will be always works of art, works of literature, which will be controversial for one reason or another. And so I feel that there is a case to be made that we need to make a concentrated effort to make a change and not to be trend followers, which is what I've gotten to realize that that's what we are when I was studying at Texas A&M University, but in some fashion at least to be, or try to be, trendsetters. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Antonin. Thank you so much. And I will now introduce our next speaker, who is Karolina Krasowska. Yes, Karolina, that's you. And Karolina is, well, I didn't tell them the order. Associate Professor at the American Studies Center at the University of Warsaw, so our sister institution here. And I should also add that she is a graduate of the Institute of English Studies and a former student of Professor Parysz, who is sitting there. Hello, Marek. She is also the founding director of the Gender Sexuality Research Group at the American Studies Center. She is the author of 2 monographs, Płeć i Naród, Translokacje, Gender and Nation, Translocations, and Poradzieckie, Post-Soviet. This is the recent one, 2021. She is also the Polish translator of Judith Butler's Gender Trouble. Her monograph, Soviet Afterlives and Jewish American Literature, is forthcoming in 2024 from Rutgers University Press. The floor is yours, Karolina.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure how I'm going to manage the paper and the mic and everything, but let's see. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I think this is really the first time since 2005 when I defended that I am speaking to the Faculty of English here. So it's really curious, in fact, to be back home, I guess. I have a few notes here, and I'm going to stick to the script so that to keep to the time, and then I think in the discussion we can extrapolate. A lot of things that I have here is, I think, in dialogue with Joanna's earlier remarks, and I think what I add to the picture is the status of Jewish studies here in Poland and in the US. So, as you've already heard from Professor Włodarczyk, the introduction, my field of research, at least the one my newest monograph is a part of and the one forthcoming, is Jewish American literature. More precisely, I focus on contemporary writing by immigrant Jewish writers who were born in the former Soviet Union. More or less my generation. Kind of, you know, this is my identitarian thing. And this is linked, digression. I am the last year who had Russian as obligatory language here, so 1978. And if you ask me how Generation X is defined in this country, this is the end of Generation X. But it's also very surprising how the knowledge of Russian comes handy in this research. So what does it mean to focus on Jewish American writing within American studies in Poland? Would you find it surprising? Probably not. In the current climate, with anti-Semitism on the rise in Europe and debates around the research on the Holocaust in Poland, and as we have witnessed in the basically two previous days, years too, but days, around the 80th anniversary of Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, it may be a field which has emancipatory potential here. And it may even be instrumental in showing Polish students racialized logic that functions in more or less latent form in everyday life. Focusing on Soviet-born writers or doing Eastern Europe-inflected research on the US can only further the relevance of this research here. But the relative naturalness of this research area here is very specific and does not translate into the American context that would be shaped by the intersection of Slavic, Jewish, and one would think at least, American studies. Through the strict disciplinary divisions of the American Academy, along with its thematic publishing series, Joanna talked about this already, very narrowly profiled scholarly journals, and huge congresses of scholarly associations, many approaches tend to fit into one research agenda, or rather marginalize or ignore the other. In most national contexts, it is difficult to conduct research across multiple areas. This also pertains to Poland. But the genealogy of American Slavic studies on the one hand and Jewish studies on the other definitely does not make it any easier. In short, and this is also, Joanna mentioned this, Slavic studies had its Cold War genealogy as area studies, also with an emphasis on foreign language and literature, and with a strong dominance of the Soviet Union, and especially relevant today, Russianness. Quote, in some cases, area studies programs were Cold War products designed to help you to know the enemy, end quote. Correspondingly, a Slavic Studies Scholarly Society, the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies, as it is known now, was established at the dawn of the Cold War in 1948. American Jewish studies, on the other hand, can be traced back to the emancipatory civil rights movement of the late 1960s, which allowed for the development of ethnic studies. The Association of Jewish Studies, AJS, was founded in 1969. I'm currently a division co-chair of the gender sexuality division, and I witness a lot of these tensions, I would say, also, preparing the program and things like that. Thus, while at the beginning of Slavic studies signals servitude to the state apparatus, the initiating impulse of Jewish studies was the criticism of that very apparatus as based on prejudice and discrimination. Currently, critical cultural studies, a set of methods I identify with, as I think also many people here on the panel, is present in both fields. Recent works in the field of Slavic studies emphasizing global or diasporic nature of Russian language culture, the post-social heritage in American literature, the links of former communist countries with the global South, and decolonizing perspective of Russian literary and cultural studies, and now emphasis on Ukrainian cultural production, are a perfect example of this, these intersections around culture. However, this legacy of initial political positioning also seems to be present in both fields, even as a genealogy that cannot be ignored or in methodological debates. Today, however, the relationship between Jewish studies and other ethnic studies is complicated, to say the least, within the American Academy. And Jewish studies is not a part of ethnic studies programs, by no means. This is related to the perception of American Jews as white at the beginning of the second half of the 20th century in a radically racialized social landscape. As historian Sharon Greenberg, who focuses on the relation between Jews and African Americans, points out, the emphasis on racialization of Jews, or the emphasis on their whiteness, often depends on the original discipline of the researcher. Starting from Americanist positions, the emphasis falls on whiteness and privileged positions of American Jews. By contrast, if Jewish studies are the starting point, with their multitude of historical places and times, there is more talk of a difference from the privileged mainstream. I told you it's going to be tricky. Can do nothing with my left hand. Importantly, the debates and tensions between American ethnic studies, closely related to American studies itself, are centrally shaped by the academic criticism of the State of Israel. These methodological, I have 5 more lines. I practiced, come on. These methodological points of contention reveal the paradoxes of disciplinary paradigms. These questions may, however, have a different resonance in a Polish or Central East European context and require adjustments depending on the audience. American studies in the US, American studies in Poland, Slavic studies in the US, but also Jewish studies in both national contexts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karolina. I think we can already see that there are so many common points between what everybody is speaking about. But let us move on, because we still have 2 more speakers to go before we can open the floor for discussion. And now I would like to ask Eva Łuczak to speak. Let me introduce Eva very briefly, although most of you know her very well, because she is professor and deputy chair at the Institute of English Studies, University of Warsaw, and president of the Polish Association for American Studies. She is the author of many books. Let me list them. Mocking Eugenics, American Culture Against Scientific Hatred. This is the most recent one. Then Breeding and Eugenics in the American... No, I know there's a newer one, but it's not out yet, so let me get to it. Okay, then we have Breeding and Eugenics in the American Literary Imagination, that is 2015. Then, How Their Living Outside America Affected 5 African American Authors Toward a Theory of Expatriate Literature. She was a Fulbright Senior Visiting Scholar at UCLA and at UC Riverside, a Kościuszko Foundation Visiting Scholar at Johns Hopkins University, the University of California, Irvine, and visiting professor at Nanjing University, China. Eva's scholarly interests include early 20th century American literary and cultural history, modernist studies, African American literature, history of science, critical eugenics studies, medical humanities, and cosmopolitan studies. And here comes the mention of the most recent volume, which is co-edited with our next speaker. Co-written, oh my goodness, co-written with our next speaker, Ula Niewiadomska-Flis. And this book is titled Pathologizing Black Bodies, The Legacy of Plantation Slavery. And it will be out with Routledge in May. Okay. Eva?
I'm so sorry for my reaction, but you know, it's like having a baby. You know, it's our, like, we are mothers together of this baby, and that's why I was so concerned. And I'm using this opportunity actually to thank you, Ula, for for this common labor that we're going through, and the delivery. Yeah, exactly. That did make a difference to work together. This short response, actually, I have to admit that when I accepted that invitation graciously, and I was really absolutely honored, at the same time, I didn't realize what energy would go into organizing a Jubilee. And actually, I wrote something before Leonard's talk, and then I had happened something to me. That is, a student sent to me a presentation that was an AI-generated text. And then what I did yesterday, I rewrote my response, and it has the form of a confession that I'm making, so please bear with me. The question of American studies in Poland necessitates, in my view, finding the answer to 3 questions, and this is for this moment today. That moment would be different, for example, a year ago. First, what is my positionality within the field? That in turn triggers the question of representation that was discussed by Professor Davies yesterday. Well, yesterday. I even lost track of time. It also entails a practical question of the audience for my research. And 3, it involves confronting a big question that anyone working in the humanities, regardless American studies or not, needs to answer right now. How do we respond to the schizophrenic split that we seem to experience? On the one hand, we challenge the notion of humanism burdened with the legacy of Eurocentrism, colonialism, wars, and slavery. And on the other hand, how do we enter a new AI age of algorithms, in which, in the world of Yuval Harari, the world as we know, with human consciousness at the center, may be gone soon and forever. When it comes to the first issue of my position within the field of American studies, and here is my confession, as a Polish woman living in Warsaw and educated in the Polish system of education, I may not be the best candidate to interpret and critique American culture. This is something that was kind of obvious to me when I was living in the States. The awareness of this, along with the acceptance of the law of accountability that involves and necessitates a position of humbleness and openness, is not the easiest position for an academic driven by a desire for recognition. There have been so many times that I wanted to withdraw actually from American studies or academy altogether, discouraged by a cold shoulder of the American academy or by my feeling of being a trespasser. I felt like this child that craves recognition from the parent, but the parent is not really willing to give this recognition. Paradoxically, however, with time, I have discovered that this position of a constant awareness of my otherness can be beneficial. In my personal academic journey, it challenged me to dig deeper and work harder. It led me, for example, to archival research, and a difficult one, seeking an answer to what Du Bois defined as the biggest challenge to the 20th century worldwide, not only in the American context. Du Bois introduced a famous phrase in which he said that the biggest problem for the 20th century is that of the color line, which I read coming from this background as the ghost of race here in this country as well, in service of imperialism and hegemony. Based on my research, I have authored 3 books, one with Ula sitting next to me, which have explored the presence of eugenics, understood both as science and as a scientific paradigm. And I do make a distinction between the science of eugenics and the eugenic paradigm, but I will not elaborate on this here. And I got to be interested in this because exactly I thought that race is this ghost that keeps haunting not only American, US culture, but Polish culture as well. So that was my way of trying to find the answer to this, why race? And I ended up with eugenic studies. The second question of the audience for my work is even more difficult for me. As an intellectual living in Warsaw, I feel I have an obligation to this country and should enter a dialogue with intellectuals in it. I feel I have been running away from my culture as well as this country's grave political and social problems for too long. And yet I continue writing and publishing my major works in English. Working on my books, I have been thinking about my ideal reader. I believe that it's not necessarily a scholar in the US. I may be writing for anyone worldwide that wants to read America critically and who treats the analysis of the US culture as an inspiration and challenge in her own context. I do not want to write with an American intellectual in mind. I'm afraid that I might be misunderstood, and my position of humbleness and openness, for which I'm striving, and I'm not so sure I got there, might be read as a gesture of unconditional acceptance of the exceptionalism of not only the US, but also of the US Academy. If the price for not writing for an American reader, but still writing in English, after all, we are overshadowed by this huge construct that is the American Academy. If the price is my work not being known or recognized, I guess I have something of a medieval monk in me, and maybe that's exactly, or none, giving my, the way I look. I write and labor, not caring for an award or recognition. I'm a professor and have a comfy job after all, so why should I bother? The third question is actually the largest question here for me right now. How to respond to the disappearance of the world driven by human consciousness. How to write, think, and exist, and how to decide about the topics for my research in the world of algorithms, where my choices become less and less dependent on me, but are the results of the operations of algorithms that read me 24 hours a day. Yuval Harari uses the word dataism to describe this major shift in our world. To him, dataism replaces a relatively brief period of humanism, which, as we know, was faulty and problematic, and yet it believed that the human being matters. It moved away from the world with God at the center and as a principal force in the universe, to the world in which human beings were the center. Dataism, on the other hand, necessitates the whole new set of questions about the freedom in our research. Are my research choices really that free? And also about our intellectual and political choices. It also forces us to look critically at the scientific and ethical paradigm we navigate by, not to mention the question of pedagogy. For example, how to evaluate students that use AI-generated texts. So I received such a PowerPoint 2 days ago, and I knew somehow, because still those algorithms are not perfect yet, I knew that it was generated by artificial intelligence. There are programs, and ran this through the program, and I found out. So this is our reality. It's not, something that we cannot be running away from this. We have to ask ourselves what will happen to the art of writing essays, and thus to the art of argumentation and dialogue, especially with those that we do not agree with. Watching the war in Ukraine, we know that what happens when the art of the dialogue disappears, replaced by imperialist monologue straight from the pre-World War II era. There is another paradox to dataism. It acts as the agent of algorithmical colonization across the entire globe, and thus forces us humans to ask the same questions of survival in the algorithmical world, regardless the country. And thus, while critically responding to the world of dataism, we can also become more and more aware of our commonality. United in our anxiety over algorithmical emotion and empathy devoid world, we can return to the long discarded questions about what makes us human and what kind of earth, world, and values we want to preserve. I believe that the historical moment we are facing is comparable to the shift towards the eugenic paradigm at the turn of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. That was the time of the victory of determinism over free will, when human beings were reduced to biological ciphers. This time we are facing the epoch of data determinism, when human beings are reduced to mathematical set of data, be it in medicine, politics, social and private lives. I believe that the moment in which we find ourselves with the reign of determinism of dataism calls for more of solidarity and less borders. We need more of a cosmopolitan spirit, empathy and cross-country collaboration, not only in politics but also in culture. This conclusion, however, could make the whole idea of American studies a little bit old-fashioned, as it would call for an abandoning of the field of studies that enforces nationalist paradigms and political borders. But maybe this is what we should be more and more aware also also in American studies. We need to form cross-country, transnational, international alliances, not only to battle the bloody ghost of the imperial era, look at the war in Ukraine, but also to defend us against the role of algorithms, even when the quality of our life and our individual survival depends on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eva. And now let me welcome our last speaker, Urszula Niewiadomska-Flis, who is Associate Professor at the English Studies, is it Institute or is it, no, I'm sorry, Collegium, okay. At the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin. Her scholarly interests encompass representations of foodways in literature and film, literature of the American South, Southern Black studies, and ethnic immigrant literatures of the USA. She is the author of 4 monographs devoted to the study of the American South. One of them, Live and Let Dine, Food and Race in the Text of the American South, wonderful title, was awarded the 2018 American Studies Network Book Prize by the American Studies Network of the European Association of American Studies. Apart from editing 2 books on Southern studies, she also guest edited Other Souths on Page and Screen, a themed special issue of the Polish Journal for American Studies. Her most recent book project, Race and Repast, Foodscapes in 20th Century Southern Literature, was published with the University of Arkansas Press in December 2022. And her next book is the one that she is co-writing, or has co-written, because it's done, we're just waiting for it to be published, with Professor Ewa Łuczak, Pathologizing Black Bodies, The Legacy of Plantation Slavery. And this is coming out, as I said, in May with Routledge. And Ulla, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I have to tell you that the idea of what I'm going to talk about was brewing up in my system for a long time. And I knew that each of us will have a different perspective. So which is just so wonderful that you've got this kind of complementarity of different perspectives on American studies. So I come from Lublin, which is not that far, but actually it's very, very far from Warsaw. In terms of geography, it's not very far. It's just a 2-hour train ride. But in terms of the positioning of Lublin in the wild east of Poland is kind of symptomatic of what I'm doing in American studies. So I'm discussing Southern studies. The South, that is the other. It's not the wild west of America, but it's the other. So we are the other of Poland. So I'm looking at the peripheries, at the other, that like the Empire Strikes Back, so the South strikes back. So we've got this wonderful long tradition of research on Faulkner, on Flannery O'Connor, on Tennessee Williams. But there are more and more Southern studies scholars who don't jump on this bandwagon, right? So they do try to reload the canon. So there are not so many fat white dudes with cigars, like we learned in the previous panel. There is this, the research into Southern studies that is conducted in Europe, and in particular in Central Europe, is done under the auspices of Southern Studies Forum, which is part of the European Association for American Studies. And we've got conferences that usually take place every 2 years, and we look at the newest additions, let's say, to the Southern canon. So apart from, I was actually looking at what was being written by Central European scholars of the South over the last decade. And I noticed 2 trends. Now, the interesting thing is that there are those traditional perspectives that are adopted by some scholars. So they're very secure, safe, perspective that you can adopt in Southern studies. So, for example, there would be Romanian studies on the 20th century American South, which was changed by the clinging to the dead codes of the previous century that are reflected in, for example, family problems, sentimentality, vulnerability, cruelty, pretensions, masks, and selfishness. So all those leitmotifs of the Southern literature that have been present from the antebellum times. Then there are texts like Croatian scholarship on Southern womanhood in Faulkner's Yoknapatawpha County, fiction, but also there would be elements of looking at Faulkner's fiction from new studies, like there is the queering of Faulkner, right? So there is a wonderful book that was published in the States on gay Faulkner characters, and this kind of perspective is also adopted by European scholars. This very typical, challenge perspective of looking at Flannery O'Connor's narratives from the perspective of how stereotypes are challenged and subverted in her short fiction. There would be, I mean, I've got all the names and nationalities and what is being done in those countries. I was trying to pick up the essence, right, of those two trends. One would be, as I mentioned earlier, this looking at the at Southern literature or Southern culture through this old paradigm, traditional studies like literary studies. And when you look at the other trend, which is, for example, Czech studies in the morality and death in autobiographical writings of Southern authors who are actually entering the canon, right? But they are obviously, I mean, you've got authors who are under the shadow of Faulkner, and you've got others who try to negotiate their position not in relation to Faulkner, right? They're trying to create their own category, let's say. Or there would be this wonderful attempts to analyze science fiction from the perspective of Southernization of Southern fiction and fantasy genres. When I look at the South, so I arrived at American studies through the perspective of Southern studies. And then I arrived at food studies from the perspective of Southern studies. So I'm just, you know, narrowing my research area. So when I look at Southern studies from the perspective of food, I try to see how different racial relations are negotiated through foodways and foodscapes, right? So the things that what we eat, where we eat, with whom we eat, why we don't eat things defines who we are. And those kind of the rituals connected with food consumption and the spaces connected with food consumption were used by, for many years, by white planter elite, right? And it continued until even the 20th century to remind African Americans of their place, right? And actually, it's really interesting to see beyond literature. You can look at hip hop lyrics through the perspective of racial oppression, systemic oppression, and how African Americans in various parts of the South are trying to talk back. They're trying to reach the community through hip hop, and they're trying to educate them that they can actually change this vicious circle of dispossession and disfranchisement. So what is interesting about this Southern studies is nowadays I think that the second trend is the cross-pollination of various disciplines. So you can look at the South through the perspective of food studies, right? There could be, you know, multiple publications on different aspects of Southern existence through the prism of food. Also, there are interesting publications. I'm going to struggle with my page. Okay, looking at the South through as a region that is transcoded. How the South is the mythology of the American South is. Has got this potential to be transcultural identity, right? That is transcoded in music, in movies, in TV series. So this dynamic between racism, classism, and sexism that was present in literature, right, is later on carried to other media. And it's interesting to see how those those various areas of research can actually help to create a more nuanced image of the American South. So the ethnic studies, so this white fat dude with a cigar, right? So the ethnic studies, I think what was mentioned in the previous panel was that the British literature, I think was like up to the 19th century, right, was identified with this kind of identity, which is largely true about American literature. If you think about the 20th century, right, this is the moment when these peripheries try to strike back, they talk back. So we've got ethnic literatures that are blooming, and we've got the strong representation of Asian, indigenous, Latinx studies in Poland, right? And when you look again at the trajectories of the research that is conducted by Central European scholars, they actually are more or less the same as with Southern studies. So we've got those very traditional, safe analyses of vanishing Indians, hybridity, Native American community as kind of reflected in Bakhtinian chronotopes, or translocal and hybrid identities, etc. But on the other hand, we've got scholars who would look at ethnic minorities, authors, as autoethnographers, and I'm talking about Dominika Ferencz's studies here, right? About the application of effect studies to analyze ethnic identities within American studies, or the reading of ethnic studies through the perspective of illness and trauma narrative, right? Oh, okay, I'm halfway through. So, skip, Latina humor, or the literature of passing that is adopted from African American studies to argue for new complexities of ethnic representations, right, as well. And the third thing which I wanted to talk about is the food studies. And I'm really lucky because Carolina is here. So my first, actually there were 2 conferences so far devoted to American food. One was organized by the University of Wrocław, Eating America, Crisis, Sustenance and Sustainability. But something that was way more kind of culturally oriented, right, was the conference you organized in 2014. That was Thinking Food, the Functions of Food and the US American Culture and Society. So this was really an eye-opening experience for me, because I, apart from just looking at literature through the prism of food, I listened to wonderful talks by students and doctoral students who talked about food de resistance, right? They talked about evolution of ethnic foods and identity, what food means as an artistic expression, food history, or functions of food in film, or generally in culture. So this is this was, I think, the only attempt so far, right, by your American Studies Center, right? And as far as I know, the only American conference devoted solely to food in Central Europe, right? There are food studies conferences, like food and drink as symbol, food and drink as ritual, or something. But they're organized in Krakow, but they don't, you've got speakers who come from different disciplines, from American studies, British studies, historians, and etc. So this was the only 2, actually. And I think there is a niche. We should try to go in that direction, because when you look at vegan studies in University of Silesia, that's a very vibrant circle, and veganization of academy. I think this is not just in terms of canteens, but in terms of lectures and approaches to literature and culture. It's the thing that in the States, and I think in this respect we are lagging a little bit. We are a few years behind American academia. So food studies has been for the last 30 years a vibrant community in America. In Europe, we're getting there, but it's just it's slowly looming on the horizon thing. And the final thing, just the final note. I was thinking about sports studies, because there's an analogy between how food studies were accepted into Polish academia, like 20 years ago when 20 years ago, when I started doing food studies, the question was like, but why? Why do you want to talk about food? It's just food. No, it's not just food. It's so much more, right? And then after like 10 years attending conferences, and each time giving a talk on a different aspect of food studies in conjunction with American studies, a colleague of mine said, don't you get bored with this? And it's like, do you ever get bored with food? Really? It's like, it's got so many different layers in terms of meaning, right? In terms of symbolical meaning for who we are, right? So you can be talking about literature, you can be talking about music, you can be talking about arts in general, even architecture in terms of foodscapes, right? So the same thing is with sports studies. It is a discipline of its own, right, in America. But in Poland, it's just, okay, like, you know, you talk about basketball and that's it. So there are interesting, Łukasz Muniowski, right, or Tomasz Jachę, they talked about the construction of myth of Michael Jordan and how the star was born and the phenomenon, right? So I think if you think about the untrodden paths, let's say, in which Polish academia, I think, is slowly following, is the food studies and sports studies, so, and veganization, right? Vegan studies and animal studies. So that's it from me. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you so much, Ula, and thank you so much to all our fantastic panelists. There was a lot of cross-pollination going on between your talks. And I would actually like to take advantage of the fact that I am moderating and to start off with a comment that actually kind of none of you focused on one issue. I mean, you focused on lots of issues that were fascinating. Our positionality as completely marginal, being in Central and Eastern Europe as American studies scholars. Also on the kind of marginality of Polish studies within the US academia, so that is a kind of reflection on our identity as academics, on our motivation to do what we do from the position that we are in. But one theme that did not come up was students. And we are sitting here in a room full of students, and this is specifically why I wanted to comment on this and kind of segue into two questions. For the speakers and a question for the students in the room. So what I have been observing when I began my studies at the Institute of English Studies here a long time ago is that the students who were studying American studies often were fascinated with America. They truly believed in the possibilities of the American dream. And in a way, doing American studies required becoming disenchanted with that, becoming critical at some point. And what I am seeing now with our students today, contemporary students, is that in a way they are much more advanced than we were when we were entering the academia for several reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that they grew up with American culture because Poland is so saturated with American popular culture. If you ask them about their favorite shows, their favorite movies, their favorite books, it's quite likely that these are going to be American texts or at least written in English. But, of course, Hollywood, so much of it is going to be specifically American. But secondly, and this is something that I see already with my first-year students when we talk about American literature, is that they're already critical of American culture, is that they come in with kind of, which means that they can do more in a way. Because for us, we needed time, we needed knowledge, we needed that input in order to be able to get to that point. So I think this is something very optimistic in a way, that that they are in a position that makes it even easier for them to actually say something new, as you were saying, to become those trendsetters within American studies, although of course, yes, the institutional constraints are there. But the two questions I wanted to segue into is, one, who studies Polish studies in the US? Because this is a very interesting question that you did not touch on. Who studies American studies in the Czech Republic? Because again, I'm also quite interested. And finally, why study American studies in Poland? Which is a question I would want to pose to the room.
Okay, so the question is, who studies?
Yes, exactly.
Well, the most laconic answer to this would be students, obviously.
Why do they, why engage in American studies if you're living in the Czech Republic?
I would say the answer would be quite similar to the answer here in Poland. I would say the situation would be rather similar, but probably interest in the culture, interest in the arts, interest in the language itself, being familiar with the language itself, wanting to use it in some fashion. Possibly also part of students who say, well, I mean, I'm quite good at English, so why not, just English? And, they just wing it, like we oftentimes do. That's what happens. That's what happens. By the way, that's how I partially got into at university. Or shouldn't I say that? Is that? I mean, I was. It's actually related to what you said about the culture, that I always felt I was a bit different than my other friends at elementary school, because I mean I watched Transformers and whatever. We had Cartoon Network. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the name Cartoon Network. So I was watching that when others weren't, and so I was reading fantasy novels and listening to 1990s alternative music like Faith No More and Pantera and whatever. When my friends listened to Britney Spears, right? That was playing on the radio. So that's how I got into being an American Studies person. Something that I was familiar with. I feel I'm good at English, so that's how I got there. And I would say that there's going to be a large segment of students who get to studying this, you know, in the same way.
Thank you. Certainly they do not study because they are so familiar with Polish mass and popular culture. So they study because something is the students, well, first of all, whom do we mean by students here? When it comes to undergraduate programs, we have very, very small population that specializes in Polish studies. We usually have, in the Slavic department, usually someone who specializes in Russian studies, and then Polish is a minor. Or sometimes when there are heritage speakers or someone with some kind of background, we have Polish studies major. Although I had this situation once, I remember several years ago, I taught a seminar on Polish culture, 20th century, and I had this boy from a rural family in Indiana with no Polish background whatsoever, and he got so fascinated. I don't know how it happened, but it happened, a miracle happened. He got so fascinated with Polish stuff, so to speak, that he went to Poland, learned Polish. He learned some Polish at IU, but you know, then he really brought his language level to a higher level, and came back to the US, went to NYU to do Polish Jewish studies and museum studies, and now is in a PhD program doing Polish Jewish studies in the US. But it happens very rarely. Usually when it comes to graduate students, I work with a very different constellation than Slavic studies students. For instance, if I am on the dissertation committee, it's usually comparative literature people. For instance, I'm a main advisor right now to a person who does war literature in Polish, Russian, and German. Or I'm on dissertation committees in sociology, history, where Polish studies or my theoretical background, and whatever it is, serves students to basically complement other areas. And by complement, I do not mean to diminish what I'm doing. It's just that it helps them to get a holistic picture. So we are much less, I am much less invested in being this one symbolic parent to my advisee, because I know that this is not my role. I know that in some sense I really need to claim the minority of my field and make it make it into my advantage, if it makes any sense. So you really need to be a jack of all trades. You cannot, if you are a one-person show, which is or two-people show, which is usually the situation in the departments that have Polish studies, you can't say, it's out of question to say, I'm going to do Baroque poetry in Polish and Latin. That's not a good, that is not a good direction. But may I use this opportunity to ask a question to the panelists and to the room as a follow-up to your questions? Yeah, that's why I'm like claiming it. You can't tell me no. So I was really struck by the questions of positionality and validation. And here's my question: from whom do you seek validation? you will never be able to compete with American specialists doing American studies. That's not the point. I mean, you can compete with the quality of your research, but they can always refuse the validation, right? I mean, that's just the nature of the field. In some sense, the question is, ask not what American studies can do for you, ask what you can do for American studies. So what can you do to American studies that no American studies specialist in the US can do? And I think this is not a question of using, like you said, Ursula, different fields. We can multiply them. There are many trends. They are all fantastic. You can do a fantastic job. But I would be very curious what you can do with your positionality here in that strange in-betweenness of Poland, or you call yourself marginalized. Like it seems to me it's too much, because actually there is some great advantage in that limitation, that you're not American scholars in the US. And I think that Carolina actually pointed to some of the advantages. But it's a question of really formulating different, sometimes, different questions. It's not like replicating. You said we are belated with food studies. Yeah, maybe we are belated with food studies, but with other things we can bring to the food studies something else that others cannot. So I would like really to hear about your positionality vis-a-vis American studies.
Being belated is very queer, and that's a good thing. I would like to comment on who studies American studies, and then on your Polish example. I think it really depends, what institution you are talking about. And my comment about American Studies Center, even though maybe this is not how the American Center wants to advertise itself, but my two students, when I look at them here now in the room, confirm this. American Studies, I think, is very often a vehicle in Poland, or at least American Studies Center, for critical cultural studies, and really any number of studies. So I'm currently on a grant, Queer Theory in Transit, and we look at how American Studies in Poland was the vehicle for queer theory in this country. So Tomasz Basiuk, 2001, Dominika Ferenc, Tomasz Sikora. So these are Americans who popularized many of the theoretical texts. And when I look at my students, why sometimes they come to study with me, this is because of that, because of this kind of access. And privileged access because of the context. So I think this is one way to think about this, what we can do for around here, this kind of cultural transfer. The other thing, I think it's very interesting to think about the intersection and lack thereof of Polish and Jewish studies in the US. Because I think this path that you just sketched, from interest in Polish to interest in Polish Jewish, is very significant and symbolic, also because of the cultural capital of the fields. So when you think about the amount of publishing series in Polish Jewish studies, really number of people doing it, and the possibility to get jobs, it's just incomparable. And I think I would like to see, more acknowledgement of this and more dialogue. But then, of course, it's very difficult if you have Polonia the way it exists.
And if you have the structure of Jewish studies, then
of course.
I think I have actually answered partially your question, about, yeah. So maybe Ola, because I think I have answered your question when I was reading, about validation. Actually, I'm just happy I have a job. I can, I'm counting on my students, to exactly do critical. I'm using this as a kind of a way, it's an excuse using American culture to talk about bigger issues, giving the, still imperial position of the country, and that's it's not seeking validation no longer, I think I have answered this.
Mm-hmm. Let me answer your question with hip hop. So I was a few years ago, I gave a few talks in Mississippi about hip hop and the role of the presentation of soul food or Black Southern cuisine in general. So when I was going there, a friend of mine from Poland, a white woman, right? She said aren't you afraid? It's like, why should I? And then she started, I started to get worried, like, am I an imposter? How dare I come to Mississippi and criticize Black Southern cuisine and show that hip hop is actually trying to cure the community? So one thing is the imposter syndrome, because like I listen to this hip hop, or I do Southern studies from the perspective of a white woman in Central Europe, right? But I think this is my advantage at the same time. So there's this kind of loop frame here, because when I talk about food deserts, right, that are in terms of documentaries or hip hop lyrics, for example, I talk to students, or I talk to scholars then, and I tell them that it's a completely different perspective in Europe and in Poland, right? So we compare notes. So I think this kind of loop frame, like we've got two different perspectives, we can understand our position, okay, better through understanding another, right? So I think this is the, when I talk about black farming, if I compare that to what is happening to white farmers in Europe, right? In Poland, in Holland, right? So I think the advantage is that I can compare, and they are simply stuck with the just American perspective. Or I can bring, so recently there, Leonard, there have been studies on the cross-pollination of disability studies and food studies, which is just absolutely amazing. So you come from two different perspectives, you've got scholars from two different perspectives, and you start doing new research. You see how each of those can add to create a more complex image of the thing that you're analyzing. So I think this is the
potential of comparative studies.
Yes, yes. Yeah, mm-hmm.
Actually, we have here the editor. We have here the editor among us, and he's like looking up. If I don't ask me this question, but who would be very, very knowledgeable about recent trends in American studies, because he's the leading editor of a very prestigious journal of the European Journal for American Studies and Polish Journal for American Studies. And actually, an hour ago, I asked him this question, Marek, so what are the trends and what is the answer? I know the answer.
Eva, I asked you not to do this. Actually, no, in this short private conversation that I had with Eva, I gave her a very short answer, which is deterritorialization. Of course, there are trends which are popular practically everywhere, right? Because we do the kind of research which is inspired by what American scholars do, right? Basically, when it comes to individual articles, it's difficult to say what the trends are, right? I can talk on the basis of special issues. But these are specifics which perhaps the audience would not be that much interested in. So I don't know if I should elaborate on that or not, but we have published one issue on animal studies, and there is a new one which is forthcoming in a couple of years with Justyna Wodarczyk as one of the co-editors. We have two forthcoming issues on Native American studies from two different perspectives. So basically these would be the dominant trends, well, judging by the content of the journal.
I do not want to keep our audience here too long, because I'm sure that there are some who really want to go, so maybe we can continue speaking privately when we're done. And I would also like to remind those students who need to get their signatures that yes, this can happen. Professor Żarkowska is here and will sign your slips for you. So thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you very much to our audience. And let's go.
And let's enjoy the coffee break. And I would like to thank Professor